So our first instruction was to sit under our picture. So first test of initiative here. So good morning, everybody. Really great to see you all. And we're getting off to a lively start by starting.
I haven't even had a drink yet.
The water around.
Sorry.
It is going to be a lively panel because in the green room before I started suggesting tweaking the first question and they all fought back. I think most people in the room and watching today would consider themselves part of the evidence-based community. So I think this is going to be a fascinating panel. You've got the full biographies in the programme, but let me just briefly introduce my speakers. Ottoline Leyser, my colleague, is the Regius Professor of Botany here in Cambridge, and she was the CEO of UKRI for 5 years until 2025. Ehsan Masood is Nature's editor for Editorials, a science journalist who previously taught science and innovation policy at Imperial College. Ehsan and I bonded over his book about GDP that came out a few years ago. And Jennifer Rubin, we bonded over being together on the ESRC Council for some time. She is the chair of King's College London School for Government and was also the Chief Scientific Advisor in the Home Office, again until quite recently, 2025. So great panel. And that first question that they all wanted me not to change is really just to ask each of them in turn to give their perspective on this question, given those various backgrounds and different experiences, and reflect on what has changed or been surprising or disappointing over the past 5 or 10 years. In this triad of how is evidence made, what does government do with that evidence, both in policy analysis and politics, and how does that reach the public and communicate with the public? So, Ottoline, let me start with you.
Thank you. Yes, it's a big question. And all around the world, we can see very clearly the polarized nature of debates and the embedding of a variety of what we might call populist narratives. And I think the thing that I find most striking is that issue of surprise. I don't think we ought to be surprised because the circumstances under which this is happening are the circumstances under which historically this happens. We've had massive global recession followed by and amplified by a pandemic which has amplified inequalities. And all of this is happening at a time of spectacular rates of technological change and also social change. And that creates an environment for people of anxiety and uncertainty about the future, loss of things that matter to them, and loss of agency and control. And we know that that creates very fertile grounds for polarization. And so it's not surprising that polarization is happening, in my opinion. And yet we, as a community, are constantly surprised. And I think we need to think harder and more carefully about the causes of the polarization, not to focus on the little examples of evidence that is being ignored or overwritten or whatever, but understanding why that's happening. And the core issues are proper, real issues that we need to listen to people, listen and understand what those are, and therefore how we can directly address them, rather than allowing people to get into these polarized narratives where they're going to be addressed by magically blaming some other constituency. It is getting out of that in-group, out-group, it's all their fault narrative into a proper conversation about what the issues are and how we can address them that I think we, as a community, need to anchor in. I'll stop there.
I'm going to follow up. So in my own area of economics, I think one might understandably expect people to say, you've provided what you claim is evidence about how to deliver economic growth, and hello, there's no economic growth. So that's evidence that can be challenged. It's a bit different in areas like climate change or vaccinations, where actually the scientific evidence about the good it does for people or how people might properly respond is solid. So why is it So the loss of agency for sure, but why is it that when there is such solid evidence about what's good for outcomes for people that you think there's still that polarisation? Yes,
Still
I am
me.
looking at you, sorry.
I think, again, it's because the issues become anchored in in-group, out-group views rather than in reality, I suppose. I came to appreciate this many, many decades ago whilst participating in the GM debate. So that was a situation where people were very anxious about the integrity of the food supply chain following the bovine spongiform encephalopathy situation. Very reasonable anxieties about that and the role of big business in that. And GM became totemic, a new technology being introduced with no choice by big business into the food supply chain, and that then became a kind of poster child for nasty agriculture. The academic community thought that the reason that people didn't like it was because they didn't understand it, and therefore if they explained it to them, it would all be fine. And that was patently not the case. People didn't like it because it was totemic for big business dominating the food supply chain. And as soon as you lean in and start to talk to people about that, you can have a very reasonable conversation. So I think things like climate change have been drawn into the polarizing debates as examples of the liberal intellectual elite trying to tell you how to live your life. And if we view the debate like that, you come at it from a very different direction, and you're much better able to listen to what people really care about and address those needs. And our problem as academics particularly is because our identity is so rooted in our expertise and that we have this knowledge, and in the fact that we're super rational, wonderful people who would never do anything irrational. We have a tendency to view the debate in that we lean into that, our identity as the outgroup, in a way that just amplifies the debate. And we need to get under the skin of what's going on. If we really are rational, evidence-based people ourselves, it's got to be clear to us that it's not a debate about the data, it's a debate about loss of control and anxiety that we need to understand.
So we might come back to what we academics ought to be doing. Ehsan, over to you for your reflections on the past 5-10 years.
Well, well, firstly, thank you for the invitation to come. I'm slightly nervous here because usually I'm over there in the audience, or I'm sometimes occasionally doing your job. So being asked for opinions is something I don't do very often. But I'm going to I'll give it a go. So I did ask you for some leeway in terms of 5 to 10 years, because the thing that, in thinking about your question, the thing that I think still surprises me, and I know Ottoline, I agree we shouldn't be, but I am still surprised, is Brexit. I think the shadow of Brexit is still kind of completely with us, and as a sort of microcosm example of how the world of research and knowledge and scholarship and evidence was so on one side, almost irrespective of field. I talked to physicists and chemists and economists, and everyone had their sort of 10 or 5-page policy briefing. Impact of Brexit is an almost entirely negative. And then, of course, I walk into the newsroom on the morning of the result, and we're all completely shell-shocked. Just didn't see it coming. And then I think a few weeks later, brilliant producer at the BBC, who's now retired, Martin Rosenbaum, I've worked with in other things, did some analysis of the Brexit voting trends, and just picked out the fact that within leave areas, wherever you had a university, you had Remain voting. So you'd be in Middlesbrough and Lincolnshire and parts of Lancashire and, lots of places in the West Country, in Wales. Overwhelmingly leave areas, you'd see this spot of voting for Remain, and if you peel away what was below that spot, it was a university. And so again, for all of us in this room, the fact that we didn't see this in spite of the fact that all of us live and breathe and trade on evidence, or at least we claim to, I think was a surprise, and it's still a surprise.
I was one of the experts of whom Michael Gove said, we've had enough of those experts, so that resonates. But that's a very UK perspective. I mean, you've got a broader perspective across other countries, and it's happening elsewhere as well. So do you think the underlying drivers are similar across countries where we're seeing this polarisation?
I guess so. I mean, I think there's very clearly a sort of there's an economic issue, which is in a sense it's the tagline of the Bennett school, which is that growth isn't fairly shared. And and I know, Diane, you're very much sort of the preeminent expert in this, that we're in a situation where the figures for and particularly in low and middle income countries where growth figures tend to be higher than they are in high income countries, and yet there are so many other factors that are not accounted for, particularly around inequality and just other issues. And I think, again, those of us who are in this room and people in important positions of economic planning and policy making, because we're so fixated on this one thing of GDP growth, and often to the expense of other things, I think that's, to my mind, that's something that needs more careful looking at.
Jennifer, you've been on the sort of evidence-producing side as an academic and on the ESRC, and then had that experience in government as well. So what are your reflections?
So I also come from a sort of a slightly different academic background or disciplinary background than much of the panel as well. And I meant to start by saying how pleased I am to be here back at Cambridge, where I did my PhD and absolutely felt was my kind of formative years. So it's great to be here. And my PhD in my formative years was really around social psychology, back to the disciplinary point. And I'm afraid I was not as surprised by Brexit as people were mainly looking at the, what might be the rational public policy choices and things. Because people who were looking at the psychology were much more concerned about how people's attachment to culture and so on. And it takes me to one of the things I remember reading as a PhD student was a quote by Marshall McLuhan, for those of you who are familiar, which is, I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't believed it myself. And I think it kind of speaks to something about what we're saying here, like moving beyond kind of Brexit and other things. We kind of need to go a bit further upstream in people's kind of development of their engagement with ideas, of their engagement with information and critical engagement with it, in order to think about how we help this go a bit differently. And yes, the rising populism is an issue in lots of different places in the world, but it's also more so in some than in others. And I think we can take lessons from where the kind of fabric of society and how people are educated and develop their relationship with public institutions, with information systems, and so on, can be different. So just to go back a bit more parochially to my experience of the last 5 years or so or more, for me, I mean, partly this is a temporal issue rather than a kind of a wider contextual issue, but my engagement with evidence making and bringing evidence to policy has been that it's been incredibly high demand in the last kind of 5 to 8 years, because remember in ESRC when the pandemic hit, economic and social research had never been in such high demand so quickly from so many people as when we had to suddenly answer a whole load of questions about vulnerable groups and where, how we could best be reaching people and influencing behavior to help improve outcomes before we had a vaccine and all of this sort of thing. So there was huge demand then. And then in the Home Office, so I spent a full term of 5 years as Home Office Chief Scientific Advisor and the DG looking after the science and technology, the research, the data, the statistics, and so on in the department. And I was struck by, 7 Home Secretaries in 5 years. Every single one of them against the context of rising populism, huge concern about immigration and so on, they all wanted to understand the facts. They all wanted to know what the evidence and data said. Incredibly important when you're policy making, but also in understanding, one of the most fundamental strengths of an evidence system is its ability to reduce down the problem space when you've got highly contested areas and people arguing about things they feel very emotional about and very attached to. Sometimes not always, obviously, sometimes the data and the evidence is the thing that really allows people to sort of make a decision here and then argue about the bits that, that doesn't really tell you about. So, and I found across a whole number of areas, including in really, really high-pressured moments like when Russia invaded Ukraine, even before you're asked for the evidence base, pulling together data and information that will inform people who have a huge amount of pressure, very little time, the phrase, the fog of war, but they really want to do what's right for the public, so, or for the Ukrainian public, or for, whoever they're working to make policy for. So I've found that it's been a time where, even against that backdrop that we're talking about, there's been just incredibly high demand and in many cases great use of evidence. Not, obviously evidence is one of the things that feeds into decision making, and it's not always, it doesn't always go as you might expect or hope, but it's definitely been absolutely pivotal in the work I've done.
You raised this really interesting point about how people engage with ideas, and that's something that has very much changed in recent times with not only social media, but changes in conventional media as well. How do you think that has played into the kinds of challenges that we're talking about today?
Well, I mean, look, one of the ways that I learned about the difference between what would have been called, screaming headlines kind of 20 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, and now is about kind of clickbait or trying to get people to click through, is I was doing a cross-national comparative study of criminal justice systems that had managed to reduce their prison populations and had low levels of crime. And one of the things that I found, which I thought was so fascinating, was the difference between the British media and the Finnish media. Finland was one of the countries we went to. And in Finland, more than 90% of people had a subscription for their newspaper. So they got the same newspaper every day, irrespective of what the headlines were. And in the UK, most people, on the other hand, bought it from the newsstand, which really did impact on kind of, do you need a screaming headline or do you just need to report on the facts? And I think, if anything, the information environment we're in today has really expedited and amplified that kind of effect of trying to get people to see things that are more dramatic. And obviously, what is that horrible media expression, if it bleeds, it leads, and things. So I think that, we get people to focus on very emotive issues and from a very personal perspective, and then they think about the world more in that way. And I think it creates a tougher challenge, for sure.
Ehsan and Ottoline, you're both nodding. Do either of you want to come in on this one?
I mean, I think where I agree is that the British media ecosystem, I don't want to sort of take the discussion off too much on a tangent, but the British media ecosystem is peculiarly of its type. And I do agree with you that the loss of subscriptions, which is what's essentially the situation that we're in right now, I don't know whether this is going to be a permanent situation or whether it might change. But the loss of subscriptions really is changing the way in which newsrooms are operating. And I mean, to be honest, it's always been the case. If it bleeds, it leads. But I mean, these days, yes, it's a lot more. I do agree.
I think that what has been highlighted by both Ehsan and Janet are different forces that are creating silos. I think this university inward-lookingness is a huge problem. I think, social media, echo chambers, and algorithmic kind of drawing of people into particular parts of the system. Both of those things are helping to amplify these divisions in a way that I think is a core part of our responsibility, is to try to break those silos, which requires stepping out of our comfort zone into a much more open-minded, open type of discussion where we are happy to listen to people disagreeing with us in a constructive way. I think it's that feeling that people have that nobody is listening to them, which really allows this polarization to happen, because where they see somebody who apparently is listening to them, then they are very happy to absorb all kinds of versions of events that confirm, as you said, the view that they have, rather than to create an opportunity to exchange ideas in a way that is absolutely essential for us to address these problems properly.
You've got some thoughts about how to do this better, Ottoline. You were telling us about this earlier. Do you want to say more about the ideas that you're putting forward on creating this more constructive space?
I'm trying. It's tricky. I suppose I come at this from the background of science, quite broadly defined. I think science is an incredibly human skill that we all have. You can watch your 2-year-old do science in the living room. You know, what's this? How does it work? How can I make it better? Everybody does science every day, all the time, themselves, in their families, in their communities. And yet we have kind of migrated the definition of science into some highly professionalized activity that goes on in labs over there that are shiny and involve super clever people who are, who are Mr. Spock from Star Trek. They're in this rational knowledge, and that creates, amplifies the identity for people in that system to think that that is important to them as an identity, and also creates a big divide between that activity and everybody else, and that is exactly why you can polarize that endeavour as an elitist over their activity. And our response to that as a community cannot possibly be to march up to the line that has been drawn in the sand by that polarising debate and fight across it, because that legitimises the line. So I am very concerned about things like Stand Up for Science, precisely because that's about fighting back, which is exactly not what we need to do. I've taken to saying we should sit down for science. We should sit down with the people who are contesting things that we think are reliable evidence, and find out why they're contesting them, really understand what people are concerned about, and have the conversation in the place where people want to have it. It's fundamentally about creating opportunities for people to voice their concerns in a way that they are properly listened to, and that the current position of science, I think, in our society makes that way harder to do, and we have got to change it.
Jennifer, what's your reaction to that, having been on the receiving end of evidence produced by scientists and social scientists?
Yeah, so I think there's lots of different ways of framing it. I really agree with Ottoline's point about science can't seem like something so rarefied and specialized that nobody else can understand it or nobody else could do it, because I think we push people away when we do that. I think one of the interesting things is that kind of framing of certainty and confidence and knowing things and being super rational. I mean, as a researcher, my kind of default position is uncertainty, humility, knowing how incredibly much I don't know, and how I always need lots of other people to work on something together in order to get all the different disciplines and perspectives. And I think that's incredibly important for setting the scope. If you're in the context of answering public policy questions in particular, like they do not respect disciplinary boundaries or borders or anything else for that matter. So needing to kind of reach out widely for that expertise, but needing to make it as accessible as possible, and having that expertise expand into the kinds of what are people experiencing about this, and what do they understand about it, and what are they concerned about with it, and why. And as a social scientist, that's part of the evidence and the data. That's not just a kind of public consultation or kind of engagement exercise. That's really trying to make sure that we're understanding what the problems are and what we need to do to address them more deeply.
I absolutely agree, and I think a core part of this is that that identity of the super-rational expert, it's become part of our identity, but it's a huge problem for being a super-rational expert. I mean, precisely because we're people and we're not. And that's not who we are, and we have our confirmation biases and doubts and all the rest of it. But if we think we're supposed to be a super-rational expert, that creates all kinds of imposter syndrome problems and a lot of challenges in research culture, which I have also spent a lot of time worrying about. So I think this shift into science as an incredibly powerful set of tools to help us navigate uncertainty is transformational, both for the research endeavour and for wider society and for the relationship between those things. And I think we need to try to move there as quickly as we can, which is difficult because it requires everybody to change how they think about this. But it's hugely empowering.
I must say, I was always attracted by the idea of being like Mr. Spock when I was getting into doing research. And this is taking us into a very interesting area that I've thought about a lot in economics, which is the tension between the claim to discovering evidence and the objectivity that implies, and the fact that many types of evidence actually involve judgment calls. And it's a tension that's very stark in economics because we think we've got evidence, and then we like to say politicians should decide on the value judgments, but this is the optimal thing to do, this is the optimal policy. I'd like to just go around and ask each of you about this tension about value neutrality, or the claim to value neutrality, and if it's not really a valid claim, how should we start to navigate that in these public conversations? You can go. You look like you're ready to go, Ottoline.
It's a tricky one because there's such a diversity of evidence types, and one of the things I struggle with is the concept of a scientific fact. Again, we've given to science this extraordinary power of discovering the capital T truth, and my view is that if you do an experiment or collect some data or whatever, the data are the data. They are a fact. You've measured whatever it is, and that's the answer. And there are all the challenges with the accuracy of your measurement system. So you need to be thinking about that. And how you interpret those data are obviously going to be influenced by all kinds of things. Not least the question you were asking in the first place, which of course is also influenced by all kinds of things. So I think the notion of this sort of somehow clean, cold, unconnected evidence-generating system is indeed not the case. And I don't think that's a problem. The issue with that statement is that there then arrives some kind of great hyper-exaggerated postmodern everything's relative, nothing really matters narrative, which is clearly also untrue and unacceptable. So I think we need to be clear and honest about the strengths of different evidence strands, and to wrap that firmly into our conversations about how we're going to use that to try to make the best policy possible in the public good. So it's about clarity and honesty about the strengths and weaknesses of the evidence base that you're working on, and I think that's positive, isn't it? Yeah.
So Jennifer, in social sciences, the data is not the data in the same way. It's constructed and contested. So what would your answer to that same question be?
So I agree with what you've just asked, but also with a lot of Ottoline's framing. Certainly the quality of the data is super important in what you end up with, and how you interpret that data is super important as well. But actually I would go a step further back again and say what you decide is the data that you need. How do you decide what's the scope of your question, and therefore what data, who do you ask, who do you include, what's in and out of scope? makes a very big difference to what answer you come to. And I think that's sometimes where we start too quickly to run down a particular path. And if we do that and we don't sort of stop for a minute and say, should we also be talking to psychologists? Should we also be talking to neuroscientists? Should we also be talking to epidemiologists? To get a kind of as full a picture as possible. Obviously, you can't do that ad infinitum, and you do have to eventually start moving on an issue. But I think with an open mind, and again, the humility to see how it's landing, where it goes, what people's responses are. So when you said, what's the optimal solution to a problem, and then what people do with that is what ministers decide is up to them. But I mean, who decides what is optimal? There are value judgments, suffused throughout that definition of optimal, and it could be about saving the most lives. It could be about protecting the most vulnerable groups. It could be about, getting to the best long-term outcome for the greatest number. It could be, and those things might actually fundamentally be in tension with one another. And I think as social scientists, we need to kind of partly help with that translation of what this means for society more broadly in the longer term for more people and different groups and so on. I think it's a very tough job, but crucial.
Quite soon I'm going to turn to the audience and you can start doing some work. But one last question for each of you, and that's about AI and the role of AI, both in scientific production and scientific communication. And Ehsan, I'm going to put you in the hot seat on this one because you're kind of on the front lines of what AI is doing.
we very much. I think we're all. I think all of us in our own way are on the front lines of AI. I mean, it's completely transformational in terms of just the scientific practice. I think there's no two things about it. In terms of its potential, so much by way of productivity, saving time, gathering information, analysing data. Those are all the kind of the big pluses that we're seeing. I think some of the questions that we're having, both as science journalists and as science editors, is it's increasingly difficult to see what's inside the black box. When the studies come to us, which are around AI, when they go to other journals, what's under the bonnet, what's the workings, where's the underlying data, what is the data, how was it found, what's the code, can we see it, can reviewers see it? I think these are increasingly going to be important questions for research publishing when it comes to AI, almost certainly. And I think, for me, sort of personally, I look at the work that we do as writers and editors, and it is now possible, it's perfectly possible to have written work, edited work, done within seconds, within minutes, which, might take someone like me a day, 2 days, a week to do. And other than the impact on jobs, what does it mean for just cognitive development? What does it mean for the thinking process? What does it mean for the kind of the future of acquired knowledge? I think these are all questions that we're all very much thinking about.
Thank you. Ottoline?
Yes, huge, transformative across pretty much everything. Early days, part of the rapid technological change that's causing all of the anxieties precisely because of the power to transform things. Lots of positive potential, but also lots of concerns about bias, all of these kinds of things, and about navigating the change in a way that doesn't further amplify inequalities and all the challenges that we're seeing. I like to go back a little bit from the point of view of science, I suppose, as my favourite definition of science is that it's a human process that builds models of the world that have both explanatory and predictive power. And those things are incredibly important to us in navigating uncertainty. The predictive power is key, but the explanatory power for people is also key, and it's also important for the quality of the way we can use scientific evidence, because it allows you to respond much more quickly where changes, for example, don't currently fit into your model. So the explanatory power and the predictive power are key. And whilst AI is doing an extraordinary job on the predictive power, I don't think it's yet doing a very good job on the explanatory power. And whilst that element is not there, we need to think very hard about how we make the best use of this extraordinary new set of tools to synthesize information, to build those predictive models, to make sure that it serves our needs as humanity in building models with explanatory as well as predictive power.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Those were brilliant answers. I'm going to go for a much more pedestrian sort of aspect of it, which I think is really important if we want to be able to do that and have the license to continue to do that in a way, which is that I've seen lots of times from kind of trying to do this on the inside in particular, where there's a huge amount of ambition and excitement around what AI can do, whether in knowledge production or kind of almost any other area, and how it can increase efficiency, effectiveness, and so on. I think, and that's true in many areas, as you've said. But I think if we want the license to operate, as well as also if we want to really understand what it's doing and what the longer term and wider impacts of that will be, we actually need to be engaging much more with the public about it, about what we're doing, what we're using it for, what impact that's having, where we've seen it starting to go wrong and we've had to course correct. And so where evaluation has an incredibly important role, and not just a one-off thing, but ongoing, and actually making sure that people really do understand that. Because I think that kind of honesty and transparency and integrity around what we're doing and how we're doing it and what we're finding and what good it's doing and what challenges it might include, that's a kind of avoiding a publication bias, if you like, of just, ta-da, we discovered something new and it was thanks to being able to use AI. Because I think, we've talked about trust being a real challenge, and I think that's a crucial part of it.
I think there's a real danger of AI being seen as a kind of automated Mr. Spock who's got the answers, which would not be good. Okay, we've got some mic runners. I'll take a first batch of questions from the audience, and I've already got some really good ones from online. So the first one is right in the back in the corner. So make you run back there, thank you. I always try to make the mics run as far as possible. And then down here.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed that. And I just wondered if the panel might reflect on something that I think has been running through what all of you have said, this sort of tension between rational and irrational and emotional. And sitting within this kind of rational technocratic system that I think we're all part of, have you seen any changes over the last 5 or 10 years in the extent to which emotion, the way we feel, the way we respond, our sense of belonging and attachment, has been seen as valid evidence that can improve public policy making, or is there still a resistance ontologically and practically to that over this period? Thank you.
Thank you, and let's take another one at the same time, which is right down here, if I can make you run down the stairs. Weaving past the people sitting on the stairs, it's right down here.
Thanks very much, Teresa Marto, behavioural scientist, Cambridge. Thanks, a very rich discussion. Listening, engaging and trust, 3 terms that have come up. Loss of trust from citizens in democracy, I think, is really important here. I'd be really keen for the panellists to reflect on participatory policy making. So engaging citizens with evidence and their values, and having policymakers, politicians cede some of their power in order to refresh democracy.
Thank you. And I'm going to tag on a question from online. We've talked about science and social science. Could the panel say something about the role of arts and humanities in informing policy, which I might link to the question about the role of rationality versus emotion. So we'll go down the line. Ottoline.
Gosh, lots of things to wrap together. I think we're people and we are emotional, and that's a good thing. And as we've already discussed, the decisions about policy making, what kind of policy interventions are the right policy interventions to make in the public good? They are quite emotional decisions, because they involve, as Jan says, prioritization of particular goals. Is it about child poverty, or is it about educational attainment, or is it about climate change? I mean, you've got to bring a very wide range of value judgments to bear on those things, and those are emotional topics, and that's important. So I sort of don't see those things as one versus the other. I think the key is to find good ways to weave them together to make the right decisions. And those decisions, I would agree, have to be decisions that are anchored in what people care about and in trusting people. One of the most frustrating narratives is the one where people are post-Brexit, for example. I heard an awful lot of colleagues telling me how stupid and irrational people were to have bought into the slogans of the Leave campaign, and that is a very unhelpful way to think about things, and it's simply not true. It's just that the way in which different people engage with important issues is different, and we need to understand that. And so Tracy and I were at a very interesting talk a couple of nights ago about citizens' assemblies and their role in generating really high-quality input to evidence-based policy, and I completely agree with her. And again, that sort of harks back to my original mention of the GM debate. One of the places I learned so much about what the debate was really about was high-quality deliberative public engagement, where people were setting it out. It was nothing to do with ignorance. It was just to do with the fact that the debate was happening in the wrong place about the wrong issues. What people cared about was the integrity of the food supply chain. So I absolutely agree that weaving together emotions, the fact that different people express themselves in different languages differently, in a way that allows that to feed properly into the heart of policy, I think is really important. I can't remember what that question was about on the card.
Arts and humanities. Arts
and humanities, very important part of all of that. It completely fits in. And I have to say that, again, as an academic community, I think we spend far too much time bickering within our community about kind of epistemological supremacy in a way that is incredibly unhelpful and irrelevant to solving the problems that we need to solve. And we absolutely need to bring in all of those knowledge strands and all of those different areas of expertise to be able to navigate exactly across the human, emotional, thinking fast version as well as the thinking slow version. They're all humanity, and we need to make the most of both of those things to make the best decisions.
Ehsan.
I'll take the question of trust. One of the latest surveys of public attitudes to science has just come out recently from one of the UK science NGOs. Makes really interesting reading. I mean, overall, trust in scientists is high. It's falling a little, but levels are high now. Breaking that down, trust in academic scientists is at the highest in comparative terms, and then trust in government scientists or scientists with some association or affiliation to government, and then followed by business or industry. And I guess, Ottoline, that kind of leads me to your observation about the GM debate in the late 90s and early 2000s, because clearly people didn't feel, or there was a perception at least, that they weren't represented. And, fast forward 20 years, and that's sort of still the case. And that's also borne out in this survey, that although trust levels are high, but respondents are saying that they don't think that they're benefiting.
Yep.
Now, there is a relationship between benefiting and involvement, and then you might remember the period when we used to talk about public understanding of science, then it became public engagement, and now we're into public involvement. So we're sort of changing the language and the rhetoric is changing. But is it actually, are we really involving people? I thought the consensus conferences and the citizens' assemblies of that period was a really powerful way. And there was government funding around it, and there were these things done. And it was a really the sort of, those early experiments, which the UK took from Northern Europe in deliberative democracy, I think were really powerful. We never learned from them. And we didn't repeat them, and they were sort of boxed in somewhere. And then, of course, fast forward, we're in a new set of crises around trust, and we're suddenly thinking, oh, we've got to invent these new ways when we've been doing them, and there hasn't been. And I wonder if that's also a function of just our particular electoral cycle. That the people who were there are no longer there. That's kind of done and dusted and finished, and then we sort of start all over again.
Yep.
Yeah.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I'm going to start from the last one first, because in my experience of providing evidence for policy or operational decision making, the role of the arts and humanities was crucial in almost all of them. I mean, even if you take something that sounds like quite hard science, like supporting the collection of forensic evidence in a war zone, or doing wastewater analysis to understand the impact of drugs policy interventions. These sound like quite natural sciences, but of course, going into those contexts, it matters so much what the legal context is, what the ethics of them are, and what those will be perceived to be, as well as what they, what the decision maker thinks they are. It matters how people will receive these things and what their cultural norms and traditions are, as to whether you're actually working with the grain of that or going to need to come up with different ways of reaching those groups and communities. So, I just think it's suffused throughout all of it, both in the thinking about it and the doing. So, just yes on that. In terms of how people feel and emotion being, whether there's a move to kind of think that matters more, I don't think I could give you a really good, rigorous before and after of whether it was and whether it was then and whether it is now and so on. But I do know that when you're in a government department and things are moving fast and the media is publishing stories about everything that's going on, and the PM wants a decision soon, and so on and so on. Believe me, people in the department care a lot about what people feel, and know that what people are really caring about is what's going to be the big story, because people will raise it as a concern. It will be on social media and so on. And so from that perspective, what people care about and the strong feelings and so on are absolutely important. A particular emotion I actually really wanted to mention, because I don't think I had taken it into account nearly as much as I needed to when I first came into the Chief Scientific Advisor role, was the role of empathy. And I mean that not just in the kind of empathy with people who are the kind of citizens and the public about whom policy making should be, but actually empathy with the decision makers as well. Because I think if you're actually trying to reach decision makers with evidence and analysis and data, it's really important to understand what they're bringing into a room, and that includes not just their role and their legal constraints and so on, but also their emotions, their concerns, whether they had a terrible morning, whether they've just been grilled in Parliament, horrendously mauled by someone. So it all matters in how they receive information, just the people in departments are humans as well as the public. So I think there's a huge role for understanding and recognizing emotion, and I'm not sure whether that's probably answered your question, but I thought I would at least bring it up. And then finally, on public engagement and deliberation, I mean, it's been spoken to quite a lot already, but I think one of the things I would say is it can be done really well and it can be done really badly, and obviously having the time and doing it in a way that allows people to really properly engage with the evidence is crucial. Because if you just ask people whether they want more punitive, criminal justice systems or sentencing, they will say yes. But if you start to really engage them over a little bit of time and let them process it as to what that actually ends up meaning in practice, what's possible to do during a prison sentence and what isn't, what the outcomes of that are likely to be, how many people end up reoffending versus if there's a rehabilitative approach rather than long-term sentencing, you get very different outcomes. And so I wouldn't want us to just think asking people, I know this is definitely not what you would mean, Teresa, but just asking people is not enough. It's really helping them engage with the evidence and data. And I guess I would say that goes back to my earlier comment then about how we actually educate people, what our education system is like, both in relation to thinking about public policy, but also information consumption and critical thinking and so on.
I can't resist pointing out that Mr. Spock was half human, so he did have some emotions as well. Let's have a couple of questions from over here. So one in the middle there.
So I'm Jo Bennett. I'm Jo Bennett from the Agri-Environment Drone SIG for the RPAS UK. And I was wondering, in the world, there's a lot of focus on drones being a negative thing. We've just finished a project where we could replant all the trees that we need to plant for climate change in the UK in 3 years. How can we approach that with the public when they see drones in such a negative way already?
Interesting question. And somebody else put their hand up, right down here, thank you. Front row, in the middle.
Thank you for the interesting conversations. I'm Ivan. I'm a PhD student at UCL, but also work with government in Rwanda as a leader in government. And I've just come back to education after about 15 years, in public policy. And I was fascinated to come to this conversation because I've observed two things. One is that the academia, those in the academia, as you have all highlighted, maybe it's time to reflect how we are training people, those that let alone go out and are in decision-making places, because I do realize that there's a bit of a disconnect in the sense that people are trained with the knowledge, but the whole experience, maybe in the whole training, where people can go and live and work in places for short periods, is one thing that's missing, but also on how they engage, as you just pointed out, Jennifer. It's one thing when you are in the public policy and you have a professor or someone come and they're talking about something, and you do feel like much of it is not really connecting with the real issues that you face. So if you can speak about the training, how the training maybe needs also to be evaluated as we prepare those who go out to work in these places. Thank you.
Another couple of great questions. Let's go the other way around this time. And Jennifer, I'll start with you.
Hey, thanks. So I will start with that one because as the chair of the School for Government at King's College London, I am very immersed in thinking about how we train the next generations of policymakers. We've got all the fast streamers coming through, and one of the things that was incredibly appealing to me about moving from my role as Chief Scientific Advisor into this role supporting the School for Government is I worked with a lot of fast streamers and a lot of civil servants in my time on Whitehall, and I could see what they were absolutely brilliant at and what I thought were I could see some of what I thought could be improved. And I'm very much hoping to kind of work with the brilliant team at King's, and I've talked to Diane about some of this too, to think about what we do need to be doing differently. And I think there is a lot more to do. I remember, I think it was about 10 years ago when we were first thinking about a school for government at King's, and I hadn't gone into Whitehall yet, and I was travelling around talking to people at the Australia-New Zealand School of Government and at University NUS Singapore, and one of the things that really struck me from those conversations is that there's a risk that schools for government train people to do well at the last 10 years of policy rather than the next 10 years of policy. And, sure, right, because we're empirical. We know how things have been happening. We think, what lessons can we learn from that? So what do we need to teach people? Absolutely. But we're in a very fast-moving world, and it was moving fast then, and this chap was kind of quite, I thought, cogent on that. And so I think one thing is for sure, being a school for government or a school of public policy is not going to be an easy, we've worked out what the syllabus needs to be, we can just deliver it now and crack on. It's going to have to be a kind of constant reflection about how are we doing, getting feedback from people who've been through the program, not just when they're in it or when they've just finished it, but how is it working? What do we need to do more of now that you're in government? How can we support you there? How can we improve what we were doing, given what you know now about being there? Because I don't know about others, but nothing prepared me for what it was really like being on Whitehall, being in a government department. So I hadn't been through a school for government either. So maybe if I'd come here first, I would have been well prepared. But it doesn't mean you can't work. It just means you have to learn fast on the job, and there are probably things that you could help people who are coming in understand better. So that's one. Great question, great point, and absolutely. And then to the point about drones, I mean, really, really kind of relevant, obviously, at the moment. This to me is a broader question about people's engagement with science and technology as well, I suppose. I think when people can see the usefulness of something, then they're much more likely to feel positively towards it. Most people are not currently delivering parcels by drone. Most people are not planting trees by drone. So I guess part of my question back to you in a way would be, as an expert in this and understanding what is possible, would be how can we make some of those examples live and real and tangible to people who we want to reach with it. And I think that, again, goes back to Ottoline's framing for the work she's doing now, is how do we include people in these great advances? And by the way, not just show them what we're already doing, but say, what would you like drones to do? What could a drone do for you? And I think that, that could really help engage people. But, that's not my area of expertise, but I just, given what we've been talking about, I wonder.
It's a good quiz for the coffee break. What can drones do for you?
Yeah.
Ehsan.
I'm going to pass on the drones question as well. I'm afraid I don't have the expertise, and I'm definitely going to be straying outside of my own, except I'm probably one of those people who's probably fearful. I'm in the fearful camp, when I see one of. So, yeah, I'd be interested. Maybe there might be other colleagues in the audience who may know more. I do want to come back to the training question as well, and it's a great point that you've raised, and maybe look at it from the other side, which is from the side of scientists. And I would say, judging by all of the scientists that that we know, and just in science training in general, there is very little space for training in civics, training in government, training in the machinery of the state, training in policymaking, even things that are very germane to the life of a scientist, like funding. Now we have all universities, we have a sort of paraphernalia, a big infrastructure of research management, which in the last sort of 20, 30 years. And that's, of course, helped because everyone, for good reasons and not great reasons, academics have to interact with that world, which is a world that Jennifer and Ottoline and Diane, I know you know well. But it still stands to reason that within science training, particularly I would say at the PhD level, and perhaps at the master's and PhD level, there is very little education training, let alone involvement, unless someone has a particular interest. I go back to, I don't teach anymore, but I taught for many years at Imperial College, and I taught a course in policy for scientists. And most years, up until the election of 2010. I had about, it was an open call. I had 5 or 6 students, and that was it. It was very much a minority interest of a few people within the department, and somehow we managed to make it work. After that election, and the broken promise of the Liberal Democrats around fees, I remember walking into my first day in class and just hearing this sort of enormous buzz. And I just turned around and went back to the course director's office, and I said, I think you've got me the wrong room. Because I normally get 6 people, not 60. And he goes, no, this year you haven't got 60, but you have a lot more, because they're just very energized about what's just happened. And because policies affected their life, suddenly it's made a massive difference. And maybe there's something in there, but I do think that within mainstream science, postgraduate science education, I think some kind of... we don't teach civics in this country very well in any case, but I think by the time you get to that point, when you're at the PhD postdoc level, we're almost bereft of it.
Ottoline.
Yes, so I agree very much with what's already been said about the drones issue. I think where we see new technologies being used in ways that are concerning, there is a tendency to blame the technology and to think what we therefore need to do is, hyper-regulate the technology in a way that potentially then actually prevents it being used for good things that people are in favour of. And that it's a very tricky balance, because there are generic issues with drones that do need generic regulation, but I think more broadly, absolutely asking people and creating really powerful feed-in to what applications for that, and indeed many other technologies are welcomed, I think is key. And again, all the way back to the GM debate, on the whole, with the exception of a very specific set of people, it wasn't the technology that were the issues, it was who was in charge of it and what they were doing with it and who was going to profit. And if you can address those questions, then you're in a much more open field, and they are very good questions that should be addressed. So I think application separate from technology is a key area.
I'm going to link to that a question that we're not going to answer, but I think is relevant here. It's unanswerable, really. Is the polarisation that we're talking about built on over 40 years of neoliberal economic and political policy? So I just leave that with you.
I think it's built on silos, which is really the issue about what needs to change. Is we need systems thinking. I'm obsessed about systems thinking, and it's difficult and it puts people off. But unless we do it, we're never going to solve any of these things, and that's true across the piece, including for practicing scientists.
I keep telling people involved in AI that they need to start thinking about the public and social science aspects, because it's all jobpocalypse and psycho chatbots driving your teenager to suicide. So maybe they'll start to listen after the court cases in the US yesterday. Okay, another couple of questions. David over here, down here, and then the yellow jacket gentleman in the front row.
Thanks, Diane. Yeah, I'm on. David Cleveley, amongst other things, I founded the Centre for Science and Policy here. I'm picking up really on Ottoline's point about systems thinking. Now, there is a discipline which is involved in systems thinking, which employs roughly 25% of the UK employment, deals with complex problems, is based on science, does a whole load of things under uncertainty, and it's called engineering. Do you think engineering should play a slightly bigger role in all of this?
An engineer asks. In this front row here. Yeah.
Thank you. Carsten Nickel, I'm an affiliate researcher at school. The call for expert humility that was emanating so strongly from your very engaging debate, how realistic do we think this actually is against the backdrop of the politics of the knowledge economy? Because, of course, public policy, for better or worse, is made in through politics. in the knowledge economy, those who have the knowledge, that group is becoming larger, but also politically more powerful. Against that backdrop of these politics, how likely are those who have the knowledge to be actually more humble? Or am I being too skeptical here? Thank you.
How to be humble, good question. Who would like to start first this time?
I'm happy
Don't
to.
rush. Go on,
So is the question, is it okay to be humble given the way the world works now? Is it okay for scientists to be humble? I can't quite imagine how we could be otherwise. I mean, the universe is vast, our knowledge is tiny, there are so many questions. I think in terms of the impact on actually influencing or informing policy and debates and things, you have to strike a balance, right? There has to be some confidence in how you communicate uncertainty, right? But I think if we try to be overly certain, we're going to be wrong a lot, and that nothing's going to undermine confidence and trust and expertise more than saying with certainty something is the case and then having that unravel. I think actually the pandemic is sort of instructive here. It was, I thought, really interesting to see the shift from graphs that showed, point lines that just went, said this is what we think is going to happen, given all these things going on. Which, by the way, at any given point on a graph is when there's lots of things happening in the world, is bound to be kind of a bit off, if not very off. But if you say it could be, if people behave like this, it could be as bad as this, or if this happens and the vaccine comes more quickly, it could be this, and you've got a fan diagram, you're much more likely to be in the realms of that way you're showing humility about what we do and don't know. You're saying it with confidence because you're saying it's very likely we're going to be in this space, and the most likely one maybe looks like here. And you're actually building trust by showing that, I think. So yeah, I feel like the humility, I don't feel cynical about humility, personally. And having been in the room a lot with ministers who need you to speak quickly and be confident and so on, I feel like it's still incredibly important. You speak quickly, be confident, and then say, but here's what we still don't know, and we need to, and then confidently say, we're going to do something about that. We're going to work to address that gap. I think it's a balance. David, do we need more engineering? Almost certainly, right? I think, well, there is quite a lot of engineering. There is, I think, in some of the, certainly some of the kind of operational decision making and so on, and people recognize that very well. Is there enough? I don't know. Is there ever enough of each of our areas? Somebody else might know more of that. Ottoline, you had to look after the whole system, so.
Tell us about engineering, Ottoline.
So at some level, all of this, I think, is about our relationship with being wrong, which has become a really bad thing. It's been a bad thing in politics for a long time. It's become a worse thing in science because Mr. Spock isn't supposed to be wrong, whereas actually we know that being wrong it's actually quite a good thing because it means you have an opportunity to learn stuff. And I mean, being wrong because you were reckless and stupid, that's not good. But being wrong because you didn't have all the data and you made your best model and it turned out that actually there were some things you didn't know and now you know them and so you've changed your mind. I think that is key in the context of this knowledge economy. One of the crucial things that people working in the world now need is absolutely the opportunity to be wrong in a positive and constructive way. And we've hypersensitized the system so that people don't like that. It's a real problem in my experience in politics, that, the whole notion of the U-turn and the this and the that. And we need to own wrongness in a good way. And absolutely, I think engineering brings a lot of really valuable concepts to thinking about systems and understanding the dynamics in systems, which are, again, things that I think we have a harder time thinking about. We're very It's very easy to think about the parts. It's less easy to think about the interactions between them and the properties that emerge from those interactions. And until we are deeply engaged in that, then I think we won't be able to formulate high-quality, evidence-anchored policies that deliver the outcomes that we want to see. And I absolutely agree that systems engineering is one tool to do that, where, again, this kind of epistemological supremacy wars that tend to go on, particularly in academia, cause problems, is that all those disciplines have strengths and weaknesses, and the power you get is actually bringing all of them to bear in appropriate ways onto a single problem. And so all the disciplines need to be around the table, and they need to be deployed effectively and subtly in ways that address the problem that you're thinking about at the time. And again, with that level of humility that other people around the table are also contributing.
It's why in the Bennett School we are bringing lots of disciplines around the table. Ehsan, do you think scientists are getting better or worse at being epistemologically humble?
I'm going to pass on that.
Okay.
But I'll say a little bit about the humility question, only because I think people in my line of work have a bit of a case to answer. I'm somebody who's an editor. Every week I edit the equivalent of opinion articles, reflecting the voice of our publication, and I work in a team where we publish a lot of opinion commentary. And the idea that you'd have a headline with a question mark on the end of it is just, in traditional journalism training, is anathema. That you haven't got a story. You'd be sent back by your editor to say, hey, go find the story. So we, within the sort of structure of, modern, at least English language or Anglo-Saxon communication, that certainty in the 900-word op-ed, in the news story, in the lead and the headline, is very much is part of how we operate. And of course, the flip side of that is that, as we're hearing, so much of science is not certain. Science is contested. It was Carl Bernstein, who's not a scientist, the journalist, one half of the Watergate duo. He famously said that journalism is the sort of first approximation of truth, and I like to think that that's science. But within the way we communicate science, I think we have a bit of a problem here. And I think there are, and internally at Nature, we often think about, how can we better incorporate, research integrity principles within science communication in order to somehow, kind of bring those two things a little closer. It's a work in progress, but I think we definitely have a case to answer.
We've unbelievably almost run out of time. How did that happen? So I want to end with a question, an opportunity for each of the panel to tell us something about what we do next. Universities are struggling in many countries. Funding is tight. We see these powerful attacks on science and evidence and knowledge in many countries. We've got very polarized politics. So I think the question for each of you in turn is, is evidence-based policy still a thing? And what can people in this room, people watching online, those of us here on the platform, do about it? Let's go in reverse order. Jennifer. Look, I feel maybe I would. I've spent my whole life banging my head on this particular wall, but I think evidence-based policy is absolutely still a thing. In fact, ever more so. I think it's even more important in polarized times to find that space where we can actually feel we're generating something that everybody can orient to and say, well, at least we know this bit, as long as you've helped them understand that, and it's been knowledge that has been well understood and shared. I guess what I think we can do, and one of the things, and actually going to the systems engineering point as well, is I think we get, I wouldn't want us to get overly distracted by what's going on in the wider context and forget about the systems, processes, and structures that we can build that mean that even when things get difficult, there's a kind of scaffolding, if you like, that holds things in place. In my department, we had a whole range of things that were just
happened by default, and some of them are wider across Whitehall things, some of them are things that happened because we put them in place, and they really, really did help the evidence base get where it needed to be. And they were things like we set up meetings. You know when a statistical release is going to be. They're announced in advance for the most part. We set up meetings that included the communications teams, the special advisors, the policy teams, the data folks themselves, and all coming together to talk about what this release. You can't talk about what the release will be because the data isn't there yet, but you can sort of war game it, if you like, scenario game it, and say, here is a range of possibilities. Here's what it might mean. Make sure that the people listening, the people in the room, understand what the data would or wouldn't mean, no matter what it says, because that's like the first step. So I think, starting further back, preparing the ground, having structures and mechanisms in place, impact assessments, which have to be done for any policy that is likely to have a significant impact, which you would think is most policies, because otherwise, why are you making it? They have to be laid before Parliament, and if you do those and you do them well, you're thinking about what's the likely impact of this. You're building evidence in. If you start further upstream in the discussion with policy teams and special advisors and ministers about that impact assessment, you're building in an understanding for them of the evidence base in a way that says, and you're about to announce this, by the way, so you may want to know this kind of thing. So I think there are definitely things that we can do that make it more likely to succeed. But I wouldn't want it to all be down to an individual person or whether the media is accepting something or not, or how the public feels about it. There's often very significant ways you can build in a chance of success. And I think in terms of what everybody here can do, I think engaging with the structures like science advisory councils, like the chief scientific advisors across Whitehall, like all of that is in the public domain, who they are, or at least for most of the science advisory councils, who they are. It should be possible to reach them. Most of them have university or academic affiliations, and send information that would be useful and important for them. And also, if you're interested in engaging, I mean, I became a chief scientific advisor 5 years ago, but I had years before that been on the Ministry of Justice's data evidence and science board. So when you see a call for applications to be on a SAC, if you're interested, you could learn a huge amount about how policy making and science for policy works by doing that sort of thing.
Ehsan.
I guess I'll say that, or I'll end with, so evidence for policy for evidence, is very much a branch of social science, and the social sciences and the humanities are the disciplines which are under pressure, particularly in more populist/authoritarian governing systems. And, we're seeing where things have gone. The US is a pretty live case study of what happens to different disciplines in such a system. We've seen it before in other countries in Europe and also in other parts of the world. And who knows, when there's an election here, we might end up electing our own version of a populist government. And I think in that scenario, it is possible that there will be more pressure on social science and humanities. And I guess there my plea would be for some degree of unity, because there will be, within those of us in this room, there'll be pressures on those on the science and engineering side, which will be perhaps seen as more favored disciplines, and other disciplines will be less favored. And of course, there'll be tensions and questions within the academy. So I think a plea for some unity in this kind of coming storm, I think, would be one thing. The other thing I'd want to say, I always try and end with some book recommendations, especially when I see a lot of students in the audience. So 2 books to recommend. One is just about to be published. It's called Beyond Belief, and it's about evidence and policy. It's by my great colleague, Helen Pearson, who's a Nature editor and a professor of practice at UCL. And Helen has done a really good survey of the landscape of evidence and policy making, particularly in science. And the other one is a book that is, I think, due out either later this year or early next year, and it's a biography of Dana Meadows, the great pioneer of systems thinking, and the author is Sarah Dry. So there you go.
Thank you. Ottoline.
So I think evidence-based policy is alive and well, and it is and I include strongly the populist use of very well evidenced approaches for polarizing and getting yourself elected and into positions of strong power. And that's evidence-based. It's just evidence-based in a way that's focusing on an outcome that is not the kind of outcome that we think public policy should be about. And we need to recognize that and respond in a way that deals constructively with that. And already great points made about how academia, for example, can engage with high-quality policy making. I would go back to the fact, though, that we have, at some level, set ourselves up in academia to be the target for that populist polarization because of the ease with which it's possible to point us up to us as an elite. I think one of the most powerful ways to dismantle that is to open the doors up to university. That we know that actually the local roles of universities as civic organizations sitting in the place where they are is one of the most powerful ways to break down those barriers and to move away from this idea of the ivory tower elitism that is so easy to depict. And so I think rebuilding the key role of universities locally in addressing local issues, engaging locally and providing places for people to come and create that high quality debate space where being wrong is valued and difference is welcomed. Those kinds of things we can do very actively locally where we are. And I think we need to get out of our kind of treadwheel that we've embedded in the university system, where the things that are valued are not the things that we came into the system to do in the first place and are not the things that people value nationally. And that's on us to do that. And it's, I think, a key responsibility in these very challenging times.
I'm going to add another book recommendation. Ottoline is writing a book about these very issues, so look out for it when it comes out. What a great panel. We now have a coffee break. You've only got 25 minutes because I've been so bad at timekeeping, so please get back at noon. And I'm told there are 3 coffee stations, so you don't need to join the first queue that you can see. There are 3 queues. But please join me in thanking a great panel.